Thank you very much for coming to my talk. Honestly, I didn't expect this much of people come to a talk from someone from math department. So I suppose we both share the same passion, that is the equations and theoretical models. So I will not hesitate to hide any of those in my talk today. Actually, it's too late. I cannot, because my talk involves many equations. Just please bear with me. And if you have any questions, let me know your question. I prefer to answer your questions while I'm presenting my work here. This is somehow a review of all what I have done during the past years since I graduated on fractured and boggy porous media. I name it the complex structured porous media. So I am Mojdeh Rasoulzadeh from Department of Mathematics, and in this talk, I will talk about transport process in complex structured porous systems. So basically, we want to, if we take the groundwater systems, we want to see how the chemical species transport in a porous system that is not homogeneous. So we have different inhomogeneity features like fractures, cavities, perforations present in the system. In order to look into the transport problem, first we need to know the flow ahead. So, or at the same time, at least, if we do decoupled or we do the coupled problem solving. So the flow problem in a homogeneous porous system or in a porous system basically is resulted from conservation of mass and conservation of momentum. Conservation of momentum in porous media is the simplest fluid mechanics problem in which we know ahead that velocity is proportional to the pressure gradient. If I want to use the language of the hydrogeologist, instead of pressure, I would use the hydraulic head. But in most of my talk, I will use pressure because some parts of this research was done when I was a postdoc back in Schlumberger and Total, two of the oil and gas companies. So when we look into the conservation of mass and momentum, they both together give us a second order differential equation, a parabolic equation, in which this K here, for example, is the hydraulic conductivity, and here is the permeability divided by fluid viscosity. If the medium is homogeneous, then this second order parabolic differential equation is a classic differential equation. We can solve it analytically. We can solve it numerically using a wide range of open source codes, finite difference, finite volume, finite element codes. I put a picture of a handbook of diffusion. This handbook is a very big handbook, and it contains all kinds of solutions to the diffusion equation with a variety of boundary conditions, initial conditions in different coordinate systems, etc., etc. So check this, the flow problem in a homogeneous porous medium, not a big question. It comes to transport modeling. So transport is the classic advection dispersion equation, as we know, and we can actually know, once we know the flow, we know the fluid velocity at each location, and we can solve for transport. Again, using either analytical solutions or numerical solutions. To just bring a little bit of touch of groundwater flow modeling, I included this example, which I was indirectly involved in that. And this is the example of surface water and groundwater interaction. So we had the groundwater well monitors in a polluted site, in an industrial site, in which we monitored the groundwater level and water chemistry in the groundwater. And also we had the gauges, stream gauges in the river, where we measured the surface water level and the chemistry in the water, in the river. we measured the concentration of arsenic, boron, cobalt in both locations, and we noticed that the arsenic concentration in the river is higher compared to the concentration of the arsenic in the groundwater. The question that was raised was that during the year, with the fluctuations in the groundwater level and in the stream level, what will happen in terms of the chemistry in the groundwater? Will some of this contamination go to the groundwater when the river level is higher compared to the groundwater? So here is a very simple simulation of what happens. Here we have a head of representing the groundwater level on the left-hand side, and we have the time-varying head representing the river level on the right-hand side. And we look into the concentration of arsenic in this model. You can see as time goes on, these two boundary conditions that would change with time will actually result in a flow in the direction from river to the water, wherever the water level is below the river level. Here in the blue curve shows the river level, and the red curve shows the groundwater level. So in this example, we basically see that some concentration of arsenic will get through the groundwater due to the fluctuations in the both groundwater and river level. For me, looking into this example, what do I see? Okay, so this is an example. As I told you, I was indirectly involved in that. So I saw the person that was doing this, my husband, at home, and just chatting about this example. But for me, the concern was, what if the medium here, this transition zone, is inhomogeneous? What if it is fractured? What if we have some inclusions in there? We will not have same thing, and who knows whether that is homogeneous or not. So for me, the question is, if we have those fractures, and this length of simulation is 100 meters, will we see the breakthrough of arsenic farther in the groundwater model or not? So that's all I want to emphasize during my talk today, that most of the time when we look into the contaminant transport in subsurface systems, we drop the inhomogeneities. And that is actually something that in some cases at least, we need to care about it. I asked my friend, Dr. Guthrie, in Geological Survey of Alabama, to share with me one example of the work that they were doing in GSA, and they actually had the fractured aquifer. He shared with me his amazing talk prepared in 2019. He shared these slides with me. They did a characterization of the hydrogeology of karst aquifers in Madison County in North Alabama. In this work, they actually concluded that the groundwater transport occurs mainly through the fractures in this aquifer. And they summarize the direction of the fractures from northeast to southwest and from northwest to southeast. And they located all the sinkholes, the springs, etc. in their work. So again, as we all already know, but there are strong evidences that karst aquifers cannot be considered completely homogeneous. They are fractured, and they can have vogs and sinkholes in them. So when that is the case, and also in addition to that, in addition to have just fractures, we see the basalt formations, for example, which is a recent trend in CO2 storage, CO2 mineralization, actually. That's a permanent storage of CO2 in basalt rocks. And as you can see, the structure of the rock is completely perforated. So you basically deal with a porous medium with large pores located over it, like spread all in the rock. What are our choices to deal with these media? So first of all, the medium properties like hydraulic conductivity or permeability are not constant. They change drastically from one location to another location. They change drastically from one location to another location means that we have a multi-scale velocity distribution in the medium. So some parts of the domain will create preferential pathways of flow. The fluid will flow faster in those pathways compared to the rest of the medium. We have more significant advective terms, advective effects in those areas compared to the other parts of the medium. We may expect to see some early breakthrough in those parts of the media compared to those parts that the velocity is smaller and we have a diffusion dominant transport process. So basically, the classic advection dispersion equation, which is based on the Fickian assumption for the diffusion, does not apply in these cases because we may observe what we call it the anomalous transport features. So we need to be aware of that too. For that, I start first talking about fractured media. So if I know a groundwater system I'm working on is fractured, what are my options? How do we deal with groundwater model? I need to first look into the flow problem and then take care of the transport. For the flow problem, the first option on the table is just neglect the fractures. That's a convenient choice, which is very popular actually. The second option is to embed the fractures into your model explicitly. So what you do, you extract the information, detailed information about the fractures, and you make a model for your fracture. And then you fill in the matrix, which is the less permeable porous media in the background, and you make your model. This is my effort to make what I just said in ModFlow. So I had to have a super fine grid to be able to represent the fractures. Otherwise, every grid cell was 100 meter. That meant that my fracture aperture was 100 meter. I didn't want to do that. So here, as you can see, oops. I was able to run few time steps, having a very high dispersivity coefficient for the fractures so that my numerical model does converge. But eventually, at some point, it stops running and I cannot run it. Why that is the case? Because behind the scene, we are using the advection dispersion equation, and the velocity term in some locations is so high, and my time step cannot keep up with that high velocity. Even with an adaptive time step, it doesn't converge. This is a structured grid. You can do an unstructured grid and get better results, but obviously not with ModFlow. You need to use other open source codes. This is a code, a British code called IC1st. I use the pFlowtran as well. These are the codes that you can use for discrete fracture network modeling and model your fractured media. But what will happen in the case that comes from the slide of Greg? We know that we are dealing with a high density naturally fractured aquifer. In those cases, we have lots of fractures in the medium, and how can we model them? Should we get information for each of the fractures and embed that into our model? So for those cases, there is one popular model which is called the dual porosity model. Maybe some of you have heard of this dual porosity model. It is also available in ModFlow. The assumption behind the dual porosity model is that we have such a high density of fractures that at every point location you can find fracture and matrix at the same time. So they are present, they coexist at each space location, and they exchange fluid with each other. And basically, the matrix, the equation of flow in matrix, does not have that diffusive term because we assume that matrix has a very low permeability. So basically, we have no internal flow in the matrix. All that happens is matrix provides flow to the fracture, and that is fracture who brings the fluid to the wellbore. So the exchange of fluid between matrix and fracture is expressed in terms of the pressure difference between matrix and fracture. That is how the dual porosity is formulated. The main assumption is you actually approximate the complex network of fractures as a sugar cube model. So you basically assume that you have the network of fracture like vertical lines and horizontal lines, and the matrix cubes are surrounded by fractures. Matrix, they do not exchange fluid with each other, they just exchange fluid with the fracture. So this is what we have available in terms of modeling in mud flow for fractured reservoir simulations. And not only in mud flow, in oil and gas also, this is a very popular model. Because in Laplace domain, if you look into the homogeneous reservoir and what you get through the Warren and Root or dual porosity model, it's just replacing the S here in the equation with f of s times s. So basically, many of the formula that we have, like for the use of engineering, we can just change them by this replacing and use them for the fractured media. That is actually very convenient, and that is one reason that dual porosity model is very popular in oil and gas industry. So here we assume a pseudo steady state fluid exchange. For dual porosity model, there is another form that says, okay, this matrix it's not like completely excluded from the fluid. We have some internal flow in the matrix, and according to the changes of pressure in the matrix and in the fracture, they exchange fluid. That is called the transient transfer function. Either of these two cases, they have their own f of s, and all we need is just replace this f of s in the formulation. So if I go just with the simplest one, with this pseudo-steady state fluid exchange, here the lambda parameter is actually a measure of contrast impermeability of matrix and fracture. So if this lambda is very small, means that the matrix is very low permeable, and if it is larger, it shows that matrix has a more important permeability compared to the fracture. I can play with this parameter. Also, I have another parameter that shows up in dual porosity model, that is the omega, that is the volume fraction. I can play with that, and for example, I can plot the compute the pressure in the whole reservoir. Here I plotted the pressure derivatives. These are also this is a very informative type of graph. We call them the type curves for pressure transient behavior of the reservoir. They give us information about the permeability, effective permeability of reservoir, etc. So for a homogeneous reservoir, we basically expect this dashed black line, but when the reservoir has fractures, we see a dip in the pressure transient curves. That is, so through the well testing, we can know that whether the reservoir is fractured or not. And then here I played with these parameters. I made lambda, which is the ratio of permeability of matrix to fracture, very small. I played with the volume fraction. I increased it a little bit. And dual porosity works. Is that the case? Of course not. That's what I'm talking about here. Several mismatches with field data and dual porosity model were reported in literature since the dual porosity model was introduced in 1960s. Here is one of the examples in the Bourdette paper, and me looking into this, I can tell there is multiple scales of fracture in the medium. There is not only one scale of fractures. So a rigorous mathematical approach to this problem will be just solve the flow problem in the matrix, solve it in the fracture, and couple them through boundary conditions. These are a set of publications that I have done in this area and mostly focused on explaining the limits of applicability of dual porosity models. So in order to solve the problem in matrix, I need to, because I have a high density media, I have to zoom into the media to be able to see the border of fracture and matrix. Where is fracture? Where is matrix? Doing that zoom in, actually I divide my space location x with a very small parameter that stretches my x so I can see what happens behind every point location. So instead of looking into the regular partial derivatives with respect to space locations, now I look into the regular partial derivative with respect to space location x and the one that was zoomed in. And for pressure in matrix and fracture, I look into the average pressure at the upper scale of medium, and also all those little fluctuations in the pressure because of I am in this fracture or I am in that fracture. So a kind of asymptotic expansion for the pressure. Okay. So using these asymptotic expansion, plugging it into the equation, averaging it, this whole thing is called a two-scale homogenization. That's actually a big theory in the mathematics. I was able to actually classify different classes of flow in a fractured media. If we look into one cell here, one cell of fractured media, we can actually see, according to the contrast in matrix permeability and fracture permeability. If matrix permeability is close to the fracture permeability, the ratio is of order of magnitude 1. Basically, matrix participates in the flow as we expected. Some of the streamlines may slightly go toward the fracture because there is the easier pathway to go. But anyways, we will see the fully contribution of matrix in the flow process. If the permeability of matrix compared to the fracture is very small, and then I have to say what is this small. So in the context of homogenization, we introduce the small parameter. That small parameter is the length of the characteristic length of one cell of inhomogeneity divided by the medium length. So this is going to be my small parameter, how small each cell of inhomogeneity is. So if the ratio of matrix permeability to fracture permeability is of order of magnitude of higher than epsilon squared, that means that I'm actually having a very low permeable matrix, and matrix will be completely excluded from the domain. It's just fractures who carry the fluid. In order to have matrices in the flow process, I need the matrices to have better permeability. The case that this ratio is of order of magnitude epsilon squared is the case that matrix does not contribute to the flow, so does not make any part of the medium permeability, but it provides fluid to the fractures. That is called a source media, or behaves like a source to the fractures. The intermediate case will be where matrix in the beginning behaves like a source and then later contributes to the overall flow. Even in these cases, for example, when the matrix is completely excluded from the fractures, that's not the case, the only case. These all go toward the parameter lambda, which was in dual porosity showing the ratio of permeabilities. I want to talk about the omega, the volume fraction of fractures. If you have very narrow fractures in your medium, and your matrix is highly impermeable, like what we have in shale formations, what will happen? We will see that a boundary layer around the matrix will be perturbed by what happens in the fractures. So basically, we will have a tiny portion of the matrix that participates in the overall flow process. And the equation of flow in such a medium, in a fractured medium, is not just a diffusion equation anymore. It has an additional term. It becomes an integral-differential equation. This additional term is actually representing what happens in terms of the exchange with the matrix. And here I summarized some of the results. For example, the effective permeability in this case, that matrix also participates in the flow. It's the effective permeability that comes from fracture, from matrix, and how they contribute with they exchange fluid with each other. In this case, the effective permeability is only the fractures. Matrix is just a source to the fracture. In the shale case, we have the effective permeability, a portion of the effective permeability of the fractures. And we basically have this term, which is called a memory term. Why this happens? Because some parts of the medium which are fractures, these are high permeable. Some parts of the medium which are matrix is low permeable. The time that it takes for matrix to respond to a pressure drop is different from the time that it takes for fracture to respond. So this difference in the time, some parts of the matrix are still responding to the previous pressure drop from previous times. It's not all synchronized in terms of the time. That's somehow explaining this convolution integral, that at each time step, how the pressure comes from all the history that you had in your medium. And again, applying homogenization theory, if you have multiple fractures, which is always the case, I mean, not always the case. This also can be the case. So we will have accumulation of the memory effect from all the corresponding scales of fractures in the medium. Here I show you the pressure derivative curves for the dual porosity model, which is these lines here, compared to the same dual porosity model when we change the parameters. The same, the corresponding one when we use the homogenization. You will see that when we have different volume fractions for the fractures, the pressure derivatives will be slightly ahead of time, or they will have some lag. So we may see some things that, according to a dual porosity model, we expect to see them in the next time, but we see them now. That's just because the model does not work for the volume fraction of fractures other than 0.5. That is the main assumption of dual porosity, that says behind every point location you have as much fractures as matrices. But we we cannot use any other volume fraction than 0.5. And here are the pressure derivative curves for the multi-scale fractured media, again, to show you those dips that show up. And in the field data I showed you earlier that didn't fit the dual porosity case. So if I say that I have the flow model somehow in place, I would prefer to use the flow model that I obtained by two-scale asymptotic approach. And using that, how can I approach the transport problem? Given that I just gave a transport problem a try and I couldn't go until the end of simulation for that very simple case that I have. What if I want to look into the transport problem in a naturally fractured reservoir? So continuous time random walk framework is one of the probabilistic approaches that has been successfully applied to fractured reservoirs. What do we do in continuous time random walk framework? we actually look into constructing a joint probability density function for all possible displacements and time required for those displacements in the medium. So your particle from any location starting, how long does it take to arrive at some location in a given direction and a given length? The continuous time random walk framework provides us, according to the time that a particle spends at a location like still and doesn't move, that helps us to construct the concentration. Provides us this integral differential equation for the concentration. Why I talk about continuous time random walk? Because continuous time random walk gives us an upscaled model that inside it we can include all kinds of multi-scale velocity distribution, all the trapping processes, all the reverse flows, or the vorticities. It is very capable to actually capture what happens at microscale in the media, but in a upscale presentation. It involves three main parameters and two main parameters and one function. This is the memory term in the continuous time random walk framework. This is the particle advection velocity, and this is the dispersion coefficient for the particles in the context of continuous time random walk. Everything starts from that joint probability density function. So that joint probability density function, which needs to be created somehow in order to us to have information to start even talking about continuous time random walk upscale model for transport. This joint probability density function, if we have it, we can write it in the decoupled form, like two marginal probability density functions, one for time, one for space transitions. The space transitions can be, there is actually some work on that can be considered as an exponential distribution. So that one is not something to worry about. This PDF of transitions in time is the heart of continuous time random walk. If we can construct this function psi of t, we basically have the upscale model for the transport. And look at this upscale model in Laplace space. It's just for example, Helmholtz equation. We can solve this for just rectangular or square shaped of domain analytically, and we can solve it numerically for other shapes. So once I know this psi function, I can construct the memory term. It's the first moment of a PDF for the space distribution will give me the advection velocity, and the second moment will give me the dispersion coefficient. And this framework can capture all that is anomalous transport by just embedding everything in the form of this psi function. If this psi function is an exponential function, you go back to the classic advection dispersion equation, and then in that case, your memory term in time domain will be a delta function, or in Laplace space will be just a 1. How can I construct this psi to actually be able to work on the transport in a complex structured media? So this psi, one of the models that is suggested for it, and it works pretty well for fractured media, is the truncated power law form. This functional requires 3 parameters, T1, T2, and beta. Beta is the one that mainly represents the anomalous behavior or not. If beta is less than 2, it represents the anomalous behavior. Larger than 2, it shows the fecant transport in the model. So there are many people who work in this area. I am personally fan and follower of what Berkowitz and his collaborators do. They did a great job in showing that truncated power law is actually a suitable choice for highly heterogeneous media. And as you can see, the beta coefficient as the Peclet number goes up, and for the extreme anomalous behavior shall be expected when we have a high Peclet number in the medium. So we see that it is below 2, which represents the anomalous behavior. What I tried to do at this stage, I tried to construct the psi for the homogeneous model of fractured media. So what I did, I had the solution for pressure in terms of the asymptotic expansion. I had that information, and I tried to construct the psi of t for I actually was able to fit this with a truncated power law for a beta that is mentioned here, but still, I mean, the upscale homogeneous model is, I can be improved if I go further in the asymptotes that I used in my modeling. So basically what I did, I looked into particle transport models. I took at every space location the velocity at that location for the advective term and perturbed it with a little bit of diffusion. And that gave me the new location for my particle. And then I looked into all the transitions in space and time that my particles, 10 million particles went through, and I constructed the joint probability density function. So I will quickly go over what I did for modeling transport in perforated or voggy media. Again, this is the case that shows up in many carbonate and karst aquifers, as well as in basalt formations, as well as in composite membranes for water desalination. We see the perforated structure of porous media in either of these applications. And by perforations, I mean we have hollow spaces that are spread in the porous medium, and these are filled with fluid, and they can exchange fluid with the background porous matrix. But within them, we don't have porous media. These are just free flow zones. And so basically, in principle, they are different from the same medium with a highly permeable inclusion. Here, I tried to show you how the stream lines are structured when you have a free flow region and when you have a porous inclusion, to just bring your attention that when you have free flow region, you may have some vortices shown up in the perforations, and that actually reduces the effective volume of perforation from your medium. So we expect, I have these big holes, and the effective permeability should be high because I have open free flow regions, but those vortices actually reduce the effective volume of the medium. Modeling such a medium, just let's take one cell and see what happens here. For transport modeling in this medium, this curvy structure of the perforation needs to be actually included in my model. Either I have to have a very fine grid, or I have to have an unstructured grid to be able to show that. And this is the simulation I did with Moose and open source code by Idaho National Lab. And as you can see, I had to put a lot of diffusion here, non-physical diffusion, to just make my simulation run. And you see, it diffuses a lot here, right? Otherwise, I have a high velocity in the perforation that just doesn't let my numerical model converge. So the other idea is just try to assign some effective permeability to these perforations and run the simulation in ModFlow, which is here is the result. Again, you see the front has a significant diffusion. That's because didn't converge otherwise. One idea is actually to obtain the flow field analytically. This is a part of the work that I presented in this paper, and I obtained the solution to the coupled system of Darcy and Stokes equations in the perforation and in the porous matrix. In terms of some asymptotic expansion, some eigenfunction expansions. And I obtained all the stream functions, the velocity in the perforation, outside the perforation. So this solution has the advantage that I have the precise information about the velocity and pressure at every location in the domain. And so I'll just quickly go over these slides that just show the capabilities of the analytical model. Shows that the volumetric flux through the VOGs is about 3 times as compared to the case that you don't have VOGs in the model. I was able to solve the same system for multiple VOGs. So basically same form of the eigenfunction expansion was used for the solution of multiple VOGs, and I obtained the velocity field, pressure field, and stream functions, effective permeability. And comparing these to the available theories for the VOGy media shows that if you do not consider the interaction between the different VOGs, etc., you will actually overestimate the effective permeability of this media. So now that I have the velocity here and stream functions, all the information is available for me to start looking into the transport process. So what happens for the transport? I have a high velocity here and I have a lower velocity here. So I used a semi-Lagrangian approach. That is, I go over streamlines for the advection and then just diffuse a little bit. As you can see, my semi-Lagrangian approach for the transport modeling gives me better results in terms of a sharp interface between where the concentration, tracer concentration is coming and where I don't have it. But if I compare the results of my semi-Lagrangian approach, which is somehow a particle transport modeling, with what I obtained through the mud flow simulations, I will see they don't match at all. So what I see through my semi-Lagrangian approach is an early breakthrough and a long tailing that shows what I expect in terms of the anomalous transport. So now that I have particle transport model in place, I start constructing my continuous time random walk framework. These are just some snapshots of how particles will flow through one cell with one perforation at the center. And as I mark them in green, red, and blue to show those are on the up, in the middle, and below. And you can see that when Peclet number is lower, you see more important of mixing in the medium compared to the case where Peclet number is higher in the medium. And this is for 1,000 particles. So I ran for 10 million particles to actually be able to construct my joint PDF function. We also noticed that in the cases we looked into, about 40% of the particles never make it through the perforation. They go other ways in the medium. These are some important informations in terms of water treatment or design of filters for water treatment. And also we noticed that most of the particles spend less than 10% of their time in the perforations, and they spend most of their time out of the perforation. Looking into the breakthrough curve, we see that breakthrough curve has 2 parts in one cell again, and this part is more steep, and that is where the contribution of the perforation shows up. So here is the joint probability density function for a single cell problem for which I can finally construct the psi of t, and I'm ready for going for the continuous time random walk framework. Here it shows how the velocity is distributed in the medium, and I actually had a specific method to extract the displacement and time transition PDFs. For multiple VOGs, as you can see here, none of the psi of tau functions, which I forgot to write it here, these are the time transition PDFs, none of them match with the truncated power law. I tried to match them with truncated power law functional, none of them who matched that. That is actually something that I would expect it, because a VOGgy media in its nature is slightly different from a fractured media in terms of governing physics, in terms of the trapping process that I will notice. So I would not expect the same truncated power law for fractured media that work here. I used a kernel density function to actually reconstruct this function and bring it into my model. So in the continuous time random walk for multiple VOGs or vesicles, what I can do is either solve this differential equation analytically, or I can solve it numerically. Numerical solution of this is also easy. So each time the transition in the space transition and time transition will be drawn from the PDF of space and time transitions, which we already constructed. And doing this for a number of particles will help us to actually find out where each particle is located. We can do the constrained continuous time random walk and bring all the conditions regarding to the boundary conditions, etc., into our model. So here are some of breakthrough curves for two different cases. Here I have a VOGgy media with matrix permeability in the background, very low permeability, and I have a VOGgy media with a matrix permeability 10 times larger than that. We can see that the anomalous behavior is more important when the matrix background is less permeable, as we expected. And also the extent of the anomalous behavior corresponds to the case where Piclet number is very large, is infinite. We also were able to find the advection and dispersion, advection velocity and dispersion coefficient for the upscaled model. So that's all I had to share with you. Thank you very much for your attention, and please let me know your questions.